They called him the Raven. At 37, he wasn't just running the most feared crime empire on the East Coast, he was the empire. Nobody looked him in the eye. Nobody said his name without shaking. Raven DeLuca had built his throne from nothing after his father was gunned down when he was just 25, and he'd held it with the kind of cold, merciless grip that made even his allies sleep with one eye open. But someone inside his own circle wanted that throne bad enough to kill for it. One rainy night on a dark stretch of highway deep in western Massachusetts, 2 black SUVs ran his car off the road and sent it crashing into a ravine deep in the woods near the Franklin County line. By morning, the wreckage was found burned, twisted, empty, no body. The news hit every channel. Feared mafia boss Raven DeLuca, missing and presumed dead. The underworld moved on. His enemies celebrated. His empire started to crumble. But miles away from where anyone thought to look, Raven DeLuca wasn't dead. He was lying broken and barely breathing on a forest floor until a Neapolitan mastiff named Brutus caught his scent, covered him with leaves to keep him warm, and ran home to the only person he trusted, a 27-year-old woman named Finley Dawson. Finn was broke, exhausted, living in a rundown cottage with her elderly grandmother, doing whatever she could just to survive. She had every reason to walk away from trouble, but when Brutus dragged her into those woods and she found a stranger covered in blood, she made a choice that would change both their lives forever. And when he finally opened his eyes 3 days later, the most dangerous man in Boston didn't remember his own name, and his mind had regressed to that of a 7-year-old child. She gave him a name, Jonah, and for 6 quiet months, they built something neither of them expected, a fragile, beautiful life together. Somewhere between the long nights and the early mornings, they fell in love, even though she had no idea who he really was. Then one morning, 5 black SUVs pulled up to that little cottage, and a man in a black suit called him by a name he didn't recognize. Now the life he forgot is back, and it's about to tear apart everything they've built. If you're new here, welcome to the family. Just hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming. Drop a like if this story's already got you hooked, and share it with someone who needs a good cry tonight. Now let's go back to where it all began the night Raven DeLuca lost everything, and the dog who decided he deserved to live. That night, a few hours before everything fell apart, Raven DeLuca sat at the far end of a wine cellar buried deep beneath the most luxurious Italian restaurant in Back Bay, Boston. The cellar didn't appear on any blueprint. There were no signs, no cameras, only a thick steel door, disguised behind a wall of wine racks, and a narrow corridor leading down to a stone staircase. This was where Raven handled the kinds of matters that were never meant to see daylight. In front of him, a man named Hector Munoz sat in a wooden chair, his hands tied behind his back, sweat soaking his forehead even though the cellar was so cold that breath turned to mist. Hector had once overseen transportation for the southern route of the DeLuca organization. He had once been trusted. Once. Raven didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply sat there, one leg crossed over the other, slowly turning a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking at Hector with the kind of eyes that everyone who'd ever faced them described the same way, like staring into the bottom of a well with no bottom at all. 17 years, Raven said, his voice low and steady like the ticking of a clock. For 17 years, I paid your salary. Your daughter went to college on my money. Your wife had surgery on my money. And you repay me by selling delivery schedules to outsiders. Hector opened his mouth as if to say something, but Raven only tilted his head slightly, and the man went silent at once, as though his larynx had been cut. That was the kind of power that didn't need weapons, didn't need fists, only presence. Behind Raven, 2 men stood motionless. The man on the right was Conrad Vale, 40 years old, broad-shouldered, hair clipped close, a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite. Conrad never said much, but every word he spoke carried the weight of a bullet. He had followed Raven from the earliest days, from the time Raven was only 25, when his father's blood hadn't yet dried on the floor, and he was already forced to sit in the chair no one believed he deserved. Conrad had stood behind him ever since, and had never once stepped aside. The man on the left was Perry Gaines, 42, the financial mind behind the entire DeLuca empire. Perry wore a 3-piece gray suit, gold-rimmed glasses, his hair slicked neatly back, a smile always resting on his lips like a Wall Street banker rather than the right hand of a mafia boss. Handle it cleanly, Raven said to Conrad without turning around, then rose to his feet. He didn't look at Hector again, not even once. For Raven, the moment he delivered judgment was the moment that person ceased to exist in his world. Perry followed Raven up the stairs, his voice mild. "Do you want me to have a car arranged for you tonight?" Raven shook his head. "I'll drive myself." Conrad, walking behind them, frowned. "Boss, you know what I think about you driving alone." "I know," Raven replied without slowing down. "And you know I don't care." It was the habit Conrad hated most in Raven. A man with hundreds of enemies, a price on his head in at least 3 other organizations, still liked to drive alone down empty roads at midnight simply because he needed space to think. "Thinking is the only luxury I can still afford to enjoy," Raven had once said when Conrad complained, and Conrad had answered, "That luxury's going to kill you one day." Raven stepped out into the parking lot behind the restaurant, got into a black sedan, turned off his phone, then merged onto Interstate 90 heading west. Rain began to fall lightly, the kind of thin mist that wasn't quite enough to turn on the wipers but enough to blur everything beyond the windows into something that looked like an unfinished dream. He drove more slowly than usual. Tonight's meeting had left a strange aftertaste in his mind. Not because of Hector. Hector was only a small piece removed from the board. It was because of the Kovac deal. Perry had presented a proposal for cooperation from Victor Kovac, an Eastern European boss who controlled a drug network across all of New England. Raven had refused outright. "We don't shake hands with snakes," he said. Perry hadn't argued, but something flashed behind the gold lenses of his glasses that Raven didn't notice, or couldn't be bothered to notice. The car passed through an empty intersection on the outskirts of Springfield when Raven saw it. A child, maybe 9 or 10 years old, stood at the edge of the road beneath the awning of a closed convenience store, and in front of the child sat a small cardboard box filled with candy. Nearly midnight. A child selling candy at nearly midnight. Raven slowed down. He didn't know why he slowed down. The child looked up, eyes wide, tired but unafraid. The kind of eyes children had when they'd grown used to the world forgetting them. Raven looked through the window at that small figure. A few seconds. Maybe 3. Maybe 4. Then he pressed the gas and kept driving. But the image stayed with him longer than he expected. Those eyes, that innocence in the wrong place, the way the child stood alone in a world far too large. Raven didn't know that a few hours later, he himself would be looking at the world through eyes just like that. He kept driving. Interstate 91, stretching ahead of him like an endless black cord. The rain grew heavier, and Raven DeLuca, the man who controlled everything, kept moving forward without knowing that the only thing he couldn't control was waiting for him just ahead, in the darkness, beneath the rain, on the stretch of road he would never finish traveling. The phone buzzed for the first time just as Raven passed the sign marking the Franklin County line. He glanced down at the screen. Unknown number, no name. He ignored it. The phone buzzed a second time, a third, a fourth in a row, as if the caller knew exactly where Raven's patience ended and wanted to stomp directly on that line. He hit the answer button through Bluetooth and said nothing, only waited. Silence stretched across 2 breaths. Then a voice came through, warped by an electronic filter, impossible to place as male or female, young or old, with each word released slowly, like someone reading out a sentence. "You should have taken the deal, DeLuca." The line went dead. Raven didn't accelerate. He didn't brake. His hands stayed exactly where they were on the wheel, but every muscle in his body locked at once. That wasn't a threat. Raven had heard enough threats in his life to know the difference. A person making threats wanted him afraid. The one who had just spoken didn't care whether he was afraid or not, because to them, the outcome had already been decided. That was a declaration. The deal. The Kovac deal. The proposal Perry had presented that night. The one Raven had refused. Not even 4 hours had passed since he said no in the wine cellar. 4 hours. Too fast for this to be a spontaneous reaction, which meant they had prepared this move in advance, which meant the offer of cooperation had never really been an offer of cooperation at all. It was a trap, and his refusal had been the signal that triggered it. Raven had only just reached that thought when headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. 2 sets, side by side, coming at him at a speed far beyond anything normal on this empty stretch of road at this hour. 2 black SUVs, no plates, dark windows, racing up from behind like hunting beasts that had caught the scent of prey. The first slammed into the rear of Raven's car. It wasn't a collision. It was a deliberate hit, precise. with just enough force to send the tail of the car jerking to the right. Raven held the wheel, pressed the gas, tried to open distance, but the road was slick with rainwater, and the tires spun before they could grip the pavement. The second SUV surged up along his left side and drove him toward the divider. Metal screamed against metal, a tearing shriek sharp enough to sound like something alive being ripped apart. Raven floored the accelerator, and the car lunged forward. But the road ahead curved hard to the left, the kind of turn he could have handled one-handed in daylight on dry pavement, but not at night in the rain with two SUVs bracketing him on both sides. The first SUV hit him again, this time in the right side panel, harder, cleaner, as if the driver knew exactly where to strike to break the car's balance. Raven's vehicle spun sideways. The front tires lost their grip. The metal guardrail on the right side of the road rushed at him in an instant, and Raven saw it, knew exactly what was about to happen, but had no time to do a thing. The guardrail shattered apart. The car tore through it, as if through a sheet of thin tin, and flew into open space. One suspended moment between earth and sky, weightless, soundless, only Raven and darkness and the sensation of falling free, something he had never known before. Then the ground came. The car slammed down onto the steep hillside nose first, the front end driving into the earth before the whole body rolled. Once, twice, the windshield exploding outward, glass spraying into the cabin like sleet. Raven wasn't wearing a seatbelt because he never wore one, a habit born from the instinct of a man who always wanted to be ready to leap from a car in any situation. And now that habit turned into a curse. The second roll threw him out through the shattered window frame. His body sailed through the air, then hit the forest floor, tumbling through brush, across exposed roots, over rocks and dead leaves, until he came to rest in a hollow nearly 30 meters from the wreck. Above him, up on the road, the two SUVs stopped by the broken guardrail. Their engines were still running. Their headlights shone down into the drop, but the light touched only the treetops, not the place where Raven lay. A car door opened. Someone stepped out, stood at the edge of the road, and looked down. Rain lashed across his face. Below there was only darkness, the crushed shell of the car giving off a thin curl of smoke, and silence. No cry for help, no groan. The figure stood there for 30 seconds, maybe 40, then turned back to the vehicle and shut the door. The two SUVs pulled away, their red taillights fading, then vanishing into the curtain of rain. They didn't come down to check. No one came down to check. Because to them, there was no need. No one survived a fall like that. And for many hours afterward, that assumption was almost right. Raven lay on his back among the dead leaves, rain falling straight into his face, but he couldn't feel it. Blood from a deep tear in his forehead ran down and mixed with rainwater and mud, turning into a dark smear across the dry leaves. Broken ribs, maybe 2, maybe 3, and every breath felt like a blade twisting inside his chest. His left arm was bruised from shoulder to wrist and lay motionless. His eyes were barely open, but he saw nothing except branches overhead and rain. He didn't know who he was, didn't know where he was, didn't know the time. There was only pain and rain and darkness, and the sense of sinking deeper and deeper into a place where light couldn't reach. The forest stayed silent. Hours passed. The rain weakened, then stopped completely as dawn approached, leaving the ground soaked and the air thick with the smell of wet earth. Raven didn't move. His breathing slowed until it almost ceased to exist, only enough to keep him balanced on the thinnest border between life and death. And then, in the first gray light of morning, came the sound of footsteps. Not human footsteps. Heavier than that, slower than that. A wet nose pressed against his neck and inhaled deeply. Hot breath washed across his freezing skin, and the first eyes to find Raven DeLuca weren't the eyes of police, weren't those of an ally or an enemy, but those of a creature the underworld had never once bothered to count. The wooden house stood at the end of a red dirt road nearly 4 miles from the town of Greenfield, hidden behind 2 rows of old oak trees whose roots had pushed the front wooden fence crooked so long ago that no one remembered when it first happened. The tin roof had been patched 3 times. One window still held a cracked pane that had been sealed with clear tape through the whole of last winter and never replaced. The floorboards creaked in exactly 3 places, and Finn had memorized every one of them. So each night, once Agnes was asleep, she stepped over those spots without making a sound. That morning began like every other morning. Agnes had already been awake, sitting in her old wheelchair in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she made tea with a dented aluminum kettle on the small gas stove. She was 74 years old. Both knees were completely ruined. Her back had curved with spinal degeneration, but her eyes were still bright, and her mouth was still as sharp as a razor. Finn stood at the kitchen table, arranging bundles of herbs into a wicker basket for the morning farmer's market. Lavender, dried chamomile, mint, and several packets of herbal tea she blended herself from the recipes Agnes had taught her. Each bundle sold for $2 to $3. On a lucky market day, she made 40, enough for Agnes's medicine and food for the week, but never enough for both at the same time. Brutus lay on the front step, his massive head, as large as a basketball, resting on his front paws, his eyes half closed. This Neapolitan Mastiff had been something Finn picked up 3 years earlier, when he was still a wrinkled little ball of fur someone had thrown away in a trash bin behind a convenience store on the outskirts of Springfield. Now he weighed more than she did. His wrinkled face looked fierce enough that the mail carrier refused to step through the gate. But in truth, he had never bitten anyone. He only liked lying at Agnes's feet and stealing peanut butter when Finn wasn't looking. "Brutus, go on outside," Finn called, just as she did every morning. The dog got to his feet, stretched, shuffled over the step, then disappeared into the trees behind the house. He often ran into the woods every morning, marking his territory, chasing squirrels, then coming back before Finn finished arranging the goods. But that morning, 15 minutes passed and Brutus didn't return. 20 minutes, 30. Finn stepped onto the porch and called for him. No bark came back. Agnes looked through the kitchen window. He's never gone this long. Finn knew that. In 3 years, Brutus had never once stayed away longer than 10 minutes without a reason. She set the basket of herbs down on the table, pulled on her rubber boots, and headed toward the edge of the woods. Meanwhile, more than 1.5 miles from Finn's house, Brutus had already found the thing that kept him from coming back. The dog stopped in a hollow between 2 fallen oak trunks, his nose working without pause, his body going rigid. The smell of blood, thick and sharp, mixed with the scent of wet earth after rain, and the faint trace of gasoline drifting from farther away where the wrecked car still lay crushed flat. Raven was there, motionless among the rotting leaves. His face had gone gray. The gash on his forehead had stopped bleeding, but dried blood covered half his face like a mask. His chest rose and fell so faintly that you had to look carefully to see it. Brutus moved closer, pressed his nose to Raven's neck, and inhaled. Then he did something only the ancient instinct of a dog could explain. He used his muzzle to push dry leaves over Raven's body, layer after layer, carefully, as if he understood that this body was losing heat and needed to be kept warm. He covered Raven's chest, his legs, his bruised arm. Then he stopped, looked at Raven once more, turned, and ran. He ran faster than Finn had ever seen him run. When Finn had just reached the edge of the woods, Brutus burst out from the trees, barking like mad, in a way she had never heard before. Not a squirrel chase bark, not a greeting, but an urgent bark, frantic, almost desperate. He grabbed the sleeve of Finn's flannel shirt and pulled, hard enough that she nearly fell. "Brutus, what is it? Calm down." But the dog wouldn't calm down. He let go of her sleeve, ran a few steps toward the woods, looked back at her, barked, then ran again, clearly wanting her to follow. Finn looked back toward the house, then at Brutus, and then she ran after him. The dog led her across an old trail, over a dry creek bed, through waist-high ferns, deeper into the woods, farther than she ever went when gathering herbs. When Brutus stopped and Finn looked down, she froze where she stood. A man lay among the leaves, covered in dry foliage, with only his face exposed, streaked with black dried blood. He was large, broad-shouldered, with black hair matted to his head. The clothes on him were torn to pieces, but even in that condition, Finn recognized the fabric as something that didn't come from Walmart or Target. This was expensive clothing, the kind she only saw in magazines and clinic waiting rooms. Her first instinct was to run. This man clearly didn't belong here. Blood, expensive clothes, no identification. Deep in the woods, this was trouble. The kind of trouble a girl living in an isolated place with a disabled grandmother shouldn't get involved in. Finn took one step back. Then Brutus lay down beside the man, rested his heavy head on the man's chest, and looked at her. That look. Finn knew that look. It was the same look Brutus had given her 3 years earlier when he lay in that trash bin, soaked through, trembling, looking at her with a single question that needed no language at all. "Please don't leave me." Finn closed her eyes, opened them again. Then she knelt down and pressed her ear to the stranger's chest. His heart was still beating, weakly, but it was still beating. She ran back to the house, grabbed the thickest blanket she had, tied both ends of it to 2 wooden poles to make a dragging stretcher. Back in the woods, she laid Raven onto the blanket, tied one end of the rope to Brutus's collar, and held the other end herself. "Go, Brutus. Home." The dog pulled. She pulled. More than 1.5 miles through the woods, sweat soaking through the back of her shirt, her hands burning from the rope, her feet slipping on the wet ground. Finn didn't stop. She didn't call 911 because there was no ambulance that could get him to the hospital 40 minutes away in time, because they would ask where she found him and why, and who she was to him, and she had no answers to any of those questions. And because Agnes had been a nurse for 30 years at the county hospital before her knees forced her into a wheelchair. And if there was anyone within 50 miles who could keep a man on the edge of death from crossing over, it was her. When Finn dragged the blanket over the front step, Agnes was already there, holding a cup of tea gone cold, her eyes fixed on the blood-covered man lying on the filthy blanket. She didn't scream. She didn't ask. She didn't panic. She only set the cup down, looked at Finn, and said in a voice so calm it was almost unsettling, "Put him on your bed. Bring hot water." Agnes didn't need to look long to understand how serious it was. 30 years as an emergency room nurse at Franklin County Hospital had taught her to recognize the line between life and death, with nothing more than a hand pressed to a patient's wrist, and the man lying on her granddaughter's bed was standing right on that line. "Turn his head to the right," she ordered from the wheelchair, her voice as calm as if she were telling Finn how to chop onions instead of how to save a life. "If he vomits while he's unconscious and stays on his back, he'll choke to death before the injuries even get the chance to kill him." Finn obeyed, her hands shaking. Agnes went on with her instructions. "Get a clean cloth, soak it in warm water, wipe the dried blood off his face so they could see the wounds clearly, cut his shirt off instead of trying to pull it over him because any movement could drive a broken bone into his lung, check his pupils with the small flashlight, and if the left one was larger than the right, that meant brain trauma, something Agnes couldn't treat, but at least she needed to know what to watch for." Finn cleaned the gash on his forehead with homemade saline, nearly 4 centimeters long, deep enough to reach the bone. Agnes said it needed stitches, but Finn didn't know how to stitch, so Agnes told her to use medical tape to pull the 2 edges of skin together and then wrap it tightly. She counted the bruises on his body and stopped when she reached 14, because there wasn't a single place on his upper body that wasn't black and purple. His ribs on the left side, Agnes pressed lightly, and Raven groaned in his unconsciousness, at least 2 broken. His left arm was swollen from shoulder to wrist, maybe fractured, but the bone hadn't pierced the skin, so Agnes told her to splint it with strips of wood and cloth bandages. Finn did everything. She didn't ask questions. She didn't stop. The first night was the quietest night Finn had ever lived through. Not because there was no sound, but because every sound carried either life or death inside it. Raven's breathing was so faint that Finn had to sit right at the edge of the bed, lean down, and press her ear to his chest every 15 minutes, just to make sure he was still breathing. Every time she heard his heartbeat, no matter how weak, no matter how slow, she exhaled as if she herself had just been granted 15 more minutes to live. Brutus lay on the floor beside the bed, his head resting on his front paws, his eyes never leaving the man. The dog didn't eat dinner that night, even though Finn placed the bowl right in front of his muzzle. He just lay there, every so often drawing in a quiet breath in Raven's direction, as if checking for himself whether the scent of life was still there. Agnes sat in her wheelchair at the bedroom door until nearly midnight, until Finn made her go to bed. "You need rest." "So do you. You're not the one who's 74 years old with 2 ruined knees." Agnes looked at her granddaughter and wanted to say more, but she knew Finn had inherited her stubbornness from her mother, and her mother had inherited it from Agnes, so arguing would only waste time. She rolled herself back to her room, but Finn knew she didn't sleep because the lamp on her side table stayed lit until almost dawn. The second night was the night they nearly lost him. Around 2 in the morning, Raven started shaking, not shaking from cold, but the kind of shaking that came from deep inside, his whole body convulsing, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes still shut but moving rapidly beneath the lids, sweat pouring through the sheets even though his forehead burned when Finn touched him. High fever. Agnes spoke from the doorway, having rolled out the moment she heard the bed creak. Cold, wet cloths on his forehead, on his neck, under his arms. Cool him from the outside. Without medicine, This is all we've got. Finn ran for cloths, soaked them in cold water, laid them over his forehead, but his body kept convulsing violently, his back arching up off the mattress in the seizure. She panicked. For the first time in 2 days, she truly panicked. "Grandma, he's seizing." "Keep him on his side. Don't let him bite his tongue. And don't panic, because if you panic, who's going to hold him?" Finn climbed onto the bed, slipped her arm beneath Raven's head, turned him onto his side, then held him from behind. Her arms wrapped around his chest, gripping tightly while his body jerked again and again. She felt every spasm running through his muscles like electric current, felt the scorching heat of his skin through the thin fabric of her shirt, felt his heartbeat pounding wildly beneath her palm, and she cried, not loud, sobbing. Tears ran silently down onto the pillow, into his hair, while she whispered close to his ear without knowing whether he could hear her or not. "Don't die. Don't die here. Don't die in my bed. I don't know who you are, but you can't die." The seizure lasted maybe 15 minutes, but to Finn it felt as long as an entire night. When his body finally went limp, she didn't dare let go. She stayed there, holding a strange man in her bed, her tears not yet dry, and kept that position until she was sure his breathing had evened out again. Brutus had sat up while Raven convulsed, both front paws braced against the edge of the bed, his muzzle close to Raven's face, his eyes fixed on him without blinking. When the convulsions stopped, the dog lay down again, but now his nose touched Raven's hand hanging off the bed, as though he needed physical contact to know the man was still there. He still didn't eat. On the third night, the fever broke. Finn checked Raven's forehead at dusk, and for the first time in 48 hours, his skin no longer burned against her hand. His temperature was still higher than normal, but it was no longer dangerous. His breathing came steadier now, deeper. Sometimes Raven moved slightly in his delirium, his fingers curling, his head turning to one side, tiny signs that would have meant nothing to anyone else. But to Finn, after 3 nights spent counting every breath, they meant the whole world. Agnes checked his pupils. Both matched now. The light response was better than it had been on the first day. "He's coming back toward this side," she said, her voice quiet but unable to hide the relief in it. "I don't know how much of him will come back, but he's coming back." Finn nodded. She wanted to say something, but her throat closed. 3 nights without sleep, eating only a few hurried bites of bread between changing cold cloths. Her body had gone past its limit long ago, and only willpower had kept her standing. Now that the danger had stepped back even a little, that willpower loosened. Finn sat in the wooden chair beside the bed, meaning to check his breathing one more time, but her head dropped onto the edge of the mattress before she could lean her ear down. Her hand still held Raven's hand, her fingers threaded through his, not for any romantic reason, but because after 3 nights of using that hand to measure the pulse in his wrist, she'd grown used to the feeling of his life beating beneath her fingers, and letting go now felt like letting go of the only rope keeping her from falling. She slept. For the first time in 72 hours, Finley Dawson slept. Agnes rolled into the room about 30 minutes later. She looked at her granddaughter slumped over the edge of the bed, her hand holding the stranger's hand, hair disheveled, clothes wrinkled, dark circles pooled beneath her eyes. Agnes took the wool blanket from the foot of the bed and gently draped it over Finn's shoulders, careful not to wake her. Then she looked at the man in the bed. His face was less gray now, his breathing steady, the strain of pain gone from his features in sleep, leaving him almost peaceful. She didn't know who he was. She didn't need to know. She only knew her granddaughter had fought for 3 nights to keep him in this world. And she whispered, softly enough that only she in the dark could hear it, "You've done well." Then she rolled herself out, turned off the hall light, and left the room to its 3 rhythms of breathing. Finn, Raven, and Brutus, still lying on the floor, his nose touching the hand of the man he'd found in the woods. That 27-year-old girl had no idea that the man lying in her bed had once sat at the far end of a dark wine cellar in Boston and ordered a life erased without even blinking. And maybe that was the only thing that kept her there, because if she had known, she would have never held that hand. The first light of the 4th morning slipped through the thin fabric curtain when Finn felt something change. It wasn't a sound, wasn't movement, but the sensation of the hand in hers suddenly tightening, only slightly, weak as the flutter of a butterfly's wings, but enough to pull her out of sleep. She lifted her head, her eyes still blurred, and saw a pair of eyes open, looking at her. But they weren't the eyes anyone who had ever sat across from Raven DeLuca in that wine cellar in Boston would have recognized. There was no coldness, no calculation, none of that bottomless depth people always described. The eyes looking at Finn were frightened eyes, wide, darting quickly around the room as if searching for something familiar and finding nothing. They were the eyes of a child waking in a strange place, and not understanding why he was there. He pulled his hand from Finn's, curled in on himself, dragged the blanket up to his chest, backed into the corner of the bed, and made that large body as small as it could possibly become. Where is this? His voice was hoarse, cracked, trembling. Not the deep, threatening voice that had once made entire meeting rooms fall silent. This was the voice of someone so afraid he could barely make a sound. Who are you? Finn stood up slowly, both hands held out in front of her the way people approached a wounded wild animal. You're safe. This is my house. I found you in the woods. He looked at her, but he clearly couldn't process the information. His eyes kept moving, to the ceiling, to the window, to the wooden wall, to his own hands, to the bandage on his forehead, then back to her as the confusion in his face deepened. Who am I? Finn swallowed. You don't remember your name? He shook his head, slowly at first, then faster, then with panic. His hands touched his face, touched the bandage, touched the bruises on his arm, as if he were realizing for the first time that this body existed and belonged to him. I don't remember. I don't remember anything. Why don't I remember anything? Tears spilled over. Not the kind of crying grown people tried to hold back before breaking. This was the crying of a child, mouth open, eyes squeezed shut, shoulders shaking, with no effort to hide it, no shame, only instinct. A 37-year-old man, broad-shouldered, scarred, solidly built even after 4 days of lying helpless, sat on the bed sobbing like a little boy who'd lost his mother in the middle of a supermarket. Finn didn't know what to do. For 3 nights she had fought fever, convulsions, wounds, and she had handled all of it because those were physical things, things she could see, touch, and respond to. But there was no medicine for this. Grandma, she called, keeping the tremor out of her voice. Agnes rolled in, looked at the man crying on the bed, looked into his eyes, and understood at once. 30 years in the emergency room had shown her cases of head trauma, had shown her people waking up with no memory of who they were. But what she was seeing in this man wasn't just amnesia. Finn, come here, she said softly, motioning for her granddaughter to step to the doorway. He hasn't only forgotten. Look at the way he's crying, the way he's curling into himself, the way he's looking at everything around him. That's not an adult with memory loss. Severe frontal lobe trauma can cause something called cognitive regression. The mind can fall backward, sometimes to the level of a small child. It may gradually recover, or it may not. There's no way to know without a neurologist and an MRI machine, and we have neither. So you're saying I'm saying that inside the body of that grown man, right now, there may be the mind of a 6 or 7-year-old child. And you need to be ready for that. Finn turned and looked back into the room. Raven had stopped crying, but he was still curled into the corner of the bed, both arms around a pillow, eyes red and wet, looking at her with a mixture of fear and clingy dependence, the same look Finn had seen in children from the housing projects whenever they'd been left too long in a hospital waiting room. She walked in, sat down on the edge of the bed, keeping enough distance not to threaten him but close enough for him to know she was there. Hey, she said gently. I know you're scared. It's okay. You don't have to remember anything right now. He looked at her, eyes wet, lips trembling. I don't know who I am. I know. Do you know who I am? No, I don't know either. Silence. Then he asked, his voice so small it was nearly a whisper. Then, what's my name? Finn looked at him, a face full of wounds, a body twice her size, but eyes that carried absolutely nothing of adulthood. She thought for a few seconds, then said, Jonah. He blinked. Jonah? Yeah, Jonah. Like Jonah in the Bible. He got swallowed by a whale and then spit back out. Like you. The woods swallowed you and spit you back out here. From the doorway, Agnes let out a quiet laugh, the kind of laugh that was half sorrow and half tenderness. That girl. He didn't laugh. He only repeated the name under his breath. Jonah, his lips moving as if he were trying it on to see whether it fit. It didn't stir any memory, but it didn't feel wrong either. Jonah, he said again, then gave a small nod. And just like that, He had a name. The only thing he had at that moment. The next hour unfolded like a strange dream. Jonah began looking around the room with eyes that Finn could only describe as wonderstruck. He touched the wooden wall, touched each crack between the boards, touched the edge of the blanket, the pillow, everything within reach, like a child discovering the world for the first time through his fingertips. He pointed toward the window and asked, "What's that out there?" And when Finn said, "Oak tree," he repeated, "Oak tree," as if it were the newest word he had ever learned. The wind slipped through the gap near the door and made a soft whistling sound, and he startled, shoulders tightening, eyes wide as he looked at her with worry. "What's that?" "Just the wind. Only the wind." "Huh?" She nodded. He looked toward the window for a few more seconds, cautious, then slowly let his shoulders relax. But she noticed he still pulled the blanket a little higher, as if the blanket could keep the wind out. Agnes made thin porridge, and Finn carried it in. Jonah looked at the bowl, looked at Finn, then gripped the spoon with his whole fist instead of his fingers, lifted it to his mouth, and slurped without the slightest awareness of how he was eating. Porridge stuck to his chin, to his shirt, to the blanket, but he finished the whole bowl in less than 3 minutes, and then looked up at Finn with bright eyes for the first time. "Good. Can Jonah have more?" Finn took the bowl, turned, and hurried into the kitchen, and there, hidden behind the wall, she leaned against the cabinet, both hands covering her mouth, crying soundlessly, not because she was sad, not because she was afraid, but because she had just realized she'd spent 3 nights keeping a man alive, and that man had woken up as a child, asking for more porridge in a trembling voice. Agnes rolled up beside her and said nothing, only placed a hand on her granddaughter's back. Finn wiped her eyes, filled a second bowl, and carried it in. Jonah accepted the bowl with both hands and smiled. It wasn't a calculating smile, wasn't deliberate, didn't carry any hidden layer beneath it. It was simply the smile of someone who had been fed when he was hungry. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, the underworld was still talking about the Raven, the man whose name made grown men tremble. But in the collapsing wooden house on the outskirts of Greenfield, Massachusetts, the man the underworld called the Raven was sitting on a bed, hugging a pillow, porridge on his chin, asking whether he could have more. The first week with Jonah was the kind of week that left Finn not knowing whether to laugh or cry, so most of the time she ended up doing both. Jonah followed her everywhere, literally everywhere. She went into the kitchen, he went into the kitchen. She stepped out onto the porch, he stepped out onto the porch. She went into the bathroom, and he stood right outside the door asking, "Where's Sister Finn going?" Until she had to explain that there were places people needed to be alone, and he stood outside nodding as if he understood, yet still didn't move a single step farther away. Agnes called him Little Duckling, because of the way he trailed after Finn exactly like a baby duck trailing behind its mother. His head tilted slightly, his steps uneven because his body still hurt, but absolutely determined not to let more than 3 steps come between him and Finn. On the second day after waking up, Jonah wanted to help Finn sort the herbs. She handed him a basket of dried lavender and told him to carry it carefully from the table out to the porch. He held the basket with both hands, eyes fixed on it, walking very slowly, very carefully, very seriously, and then tripped right over the doorway. The basket flew, lavender scattered across the floor. Jonah sat in the middle of the spilled flowers, eyes wide with horror, looking at Finn as if he'd just committed some unforgivable crime. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Finn looked at the floor covered in lavender, then back at Jonah sitting there among the purple blossoms with terror all over his face, and she burst out laughing. She couldn't help it, the first real laugh that had filled that house in a very long time. "It's okay," she said, sitting down beside him and beginning to gather the flowers one by one. "Lavender that falls on the floor is still lavender." Jonah looked at her smile, and slowly the fear drained from his face, replaced by something closer to relief. He began picking them up with her, slow, clumsy, but careful, as if every flower were something precious. On the 4th day, Jonah wanted to sweep the house. Finn handed him the broom, showed him how to hold it, showed him which direction to sweep. He gripped the broom with both fists like a baseball bat and swept backward, pushing the dust from the doorway into the house instead of out of it. Finn stood there, watching the pile of dust gather larger and larger in the corner of the kitchen, saying nothing, only biting the inside of her lip. Agnes rolled by in her wheelchair, looked at the pile of dust, looked at Jonah sweeping enthusiastically with a face full of pride, then looked at Finn, and grandmother and granddaughter communicated with a glance in the way only people who'd lived together for many years could. "Let him sweep," Agnes said. "Dust swept the wrong way can be swept again. No one's going to die." On the 6th day, Jonah discovered the gas stove. Finn was out in the garden when she heard a clattering crash from inside the house. She ran in and found Jonah standing in the kitchen with eggshells all over the floor, yolks and whites mixed with shattered shell in a bowl, and him staring at the result with a face that truly couldn't understand why it looked different from what he'd seen Finn do every morning. "I wanted to make eggs for Sister Finn," he said, his voice growing smaller when he saw her face. "But the shell wouldn't come out." Finn looked at the bowl full of eggs and shell, looked at the messy kitchen floor, looked at Jonah standing there with his hands sticky from egg whites, and realized something. He wasn't making trouble. He was trying to do something for her, in the only way a 7-year-old mind inside a 37-year-old body could think of. "Next time," she said, taking the bowl from his hands, "I'll show you how to separate the shell, but thank you for trying." The smile that spread across his face after that was brighter than any morning that week. But the moment that made Agnes laugh the hardest, a real laugh, deep from the belly, the first one in many years since her knees gave out and her world had shrunk to the size of a wheelchair, was when Jonah discovered the television. Agnes's old 14-inch TV, the kind with a curved screen, sat on a shelf in the corner of the living room and was rarely turned on because Finn couldn't afford to pay for cable. Jonah found the remote on the table, turned it over in his hands, and pressed a button to try it. The screen lit up. Sound burst out. Pictures flickered into motion. Jonah jumped so hard he dropped the remote, tipped backward out of the chair, landed flat on his back, with both legs still hooked over the seat, eyes huge as he stared at the glowing talking box and said, "What's that?" "There are people in there." Agnes laughed. Laughed until tears ran down her face. Laughed until she had to clutch her stomach because her ribs hurt. Laughed so hard that Finn had to put a hand on her shoulder because she was afraid she might fall out of the wheelchair. And when Jonah sat up, rubbed his eyes, looked at the TV, and then back at the two of them laughing, and asked, "Why are you both laughing?" Agnes laughed all over again, wiped her eyes, and said to Finn in a voice shaking with laughter, "At least he brought something into this house that it's been missing for a long time." But Jonah wasn't always only a 7-year-old child. There were moments Finn noticed and couldn't explain. Out in the garden, when she watered the vegetables, Jonah sat beside her asking question after question. "What's this plant called?" "Basil." "Why are its leaves green?" "Because of chlorophyll." "Because of what?" "Chlorophyll. It helps plants absorb light." He nodded, looked at the plant, then suddenly asked, "If you put one plant in the sun and one in the dark, how much more food will the sun one give us?" Finn stopped watering, looked at him. He sat there with the same clear, innocent eyes, head tilted, waiting for an answer, completely unaware that the question he'd just asked wasn't the kind of question a 7-year-old child asked. "Where did you get that question from?" Finn asked. Jonah blinked. "I don't know. It just popped into my head." Then he turned and pointed to a caterpillar on a basil leaf and asked, "That thing eats leaves, right?" And the moment vanished as quickly as it had come. That night, after Jonah had fallen asleep, Finn sat out on the porch with Agnes. The old woman was silent for a long while, then spoke without looking at her granddaughter. "I'm telling you this. He's not simple. His head is broken on the surface, but underneath, there's something very strong asleep in there. I don't know whether it'll be good or bad when it wakes up, but I know it's there. Be careful, girl." Finn didn't answer. She looked out into the darkness beyond the line of oak trees, listening to the crickets, listening to Brutus breathing steadily inside the house where he lay beside Jonah's bed, as he did every night. She thought about the past week, about the way he followed her everywhere, about the way he dropped and spilled everything but never stopped trying, about the way he called out Sister Finn whenever he was frightened, as if that name were the only safe place he knew, and she realized something that made it hard to breathe. She was beginning to get used to him, used to the uneven footsteps following behind her every morning, used to the endless questions, used to turning around and always finding him there. She was getting used to him far too quickly, and that, Finn knew better than anyone, was the most dangerous thing of all among every dangerous thing this man had brought into her little wooden house. Finn put off taking Jonah outside for as long as she could. But by the beginning of the 3rd week, she couldn't put it off any longer. The herbs were piled high in baskets. Agnes's medicine money had run out, and the Saturday morning farmer's market in Greenfield wasn't going to wait for anyone. She couldn't leave Jonah home alone because the one time she tried stepping out the door without warning him first, he had stood in the middle of the living room, trembling and calling her name, until Brutus barked, and she had to run back in to calm him down. And Agnes couldn't watch him for an entire morning from a wheelchair. So that Saturday morning, Finn dressed Jonah in the biggest flannel shirt she could find, one of her father's that had been left in the closet for more than a dozen years, and said, "Today you're coming to the market with me. Stay right next to me. Don't go anywhere, okay?" Jonah nodded, his eyes full of both excitement and worry. "Will there be a lot of people?" "Yes." "A lot?" "Quite a lot," he swallowed. "Sister Finn will stay beside me, right? Always." He nodded again, harder this time, as if he were trying to reassure himself. The road from the house to the market took about 40 minutes on foot. Jonah walked beside Finn, with Brutus behind them. On the stretch through the woods, he was normal, asking questions about the trees, pointing at birds, even bending down to pick up a pretty stone and slip it into his pocket. But when they got closer to the market, when the sounds of people began to carry toward them, when the vendor trucks and colorful tents came into view, Jonah changed. His steps slowed, his shoulders folded inward, and when they passed through the market entrance into the moving crowd, his hand caught the sleeve of Finn's shirt and gripped it tight, his knuckles turning white, his head lowered, his eyes fixed on the ground, his big body shrinking itself as small as possible, as though he were trying to make himself invisible in the middle of the crowd. A man standing nearly 6'3", with broad shoulders and hands the size of 2 ordinary fists, was clinging to the sleeve of a small framed girl and walking right behind her, like a child holding to his mother on the first day of school. People looked. Some looked curious. Some looked confused. Finn ignored them. She was used to people staring at her. Living in Greenfield with a disabled grandmother and a dog the size of a calf meant people were always looking. She led Jonah to her stall, the last corner spot in the row, next to Walt Briggs's vegetable stand. Walt was already there, his dirty apron tied across his heavy middle, thin silver hair showing beneath an old worn baseball cap. He looked Jonah up and down, looked at the way he held onto Finn's sleeve, then looked at Finn with a face full of questions. "Someone I know," Finn said shortly, offering no further explanation. Walt nodded and asked nothing else, because Walt Briggs, at 60 years old, had lived in Greenfield long enough to know when to ask and when to keep quiet. Finn began laying out the goods. Jonah stood right beside her, his eyes still down, his hand still gripping the hem of her shirt. The market grew busier. Voices, laughter, bargaining, music drifting from the bakery stall near the front row. Jonah drew his shoulders in every time someone passed too close, but he didn't run. He only pressed closer to Finn. Then it happened. A middle-aged man carrying a heavy bag hurried by and bumped straight into Jonah's shoulder. Not hard, but enough to make Jonah stagger back a step. The man turned, looked Jonah up and down, and instead of apologizing, he frowned. "Standing in the middle of the way like that? Open your eyes when you walk." Jonah stood there, eyes wide, lips trembling, his body folded in on itself exactly the way it had the first time he heard wind whistling through the crack by the door. But this was worse, because this wasn't wind, this was a person. And that voice carried something his 7-year-old mind recognized by instinct: aggression. His eyes filled, his chin shook. He was about to cry, right there in the middle of the market. Finn turned around. She saw Jonah's face, saw the man still standing there with that irritated look on his face, and something inside her flipped like a switch. She stepped forward and stood between Jonah and the man. She had to tilt her chin up because he was almost a head taller than she was, but her gaze didn't lift. It went straight through him. "You ran into him, and now you're yelling at him too? Where do you think you are? Step back, right now." Her voice wasn't loud. She didn't shout, but there was something in Finn Dawson's voice, when she was protecting one of her own, that made anyone hearing it understand this wasn't a woman to joke with. The man blinked, looked at the small young woman standing in front of him, protecting a man twice her size with the posture of someone ready to tear apart anyone who took one more step, then muttered something under his breath and walked away. Walt Briggs stood at the next stall over, still holding a bunch of kale, his mouth hanging open without him seeming to realize it, and then he burst out laughing. Finn Dawson. In my whole life I haven't seen anybody as fierce as you. That little thing can't weigh even 100 pounds. And she looked ready to eat that fella alive. Finn didn't laugh. She turned and looked at Jonah. He stood there, tears not yet fallen, looking at her with an expression she didn't know how to name, but it made her chest tighten. "It's okay," she said softly. "No one's going to do anything to you." He nodded slowly. Then his hand found the hem of her shirt again and gripped it, and Finn let it stay there. The rest of the morning passed more quietly. Jonah gradually adjusted to the noise, though he still didn't let go of Finn's shirt. He began watching the way she sold things, the way she greeted customers, the way she wrapped herbs, the way she counted money. Silent, focused. Then, in the middle of the morning, after Finn had just sold a batch of dried chamomile to a familiar wholesaler for $3 a bundle, Jonah suddenly spoke. "Sister Finn." She turned around. "What?" "You should renegotiate the price with that man." Finn blinked. "What?" "The man who just bought your goods. He takes the wholesale price at $3, but he sells retail for at least $7.50. You're letting him keep more than a 60% margin. If you negotiate up to $4.50 a bundle, he'll still make money, and you'll increase your income by nearly 50% without losing the customer." Silence. Finn stared at him. Jonah sat there, still holding the hem of her shirt, his eyes clear, his head tilted slightly, waiting for a response, completely unaware that the phrase margin and that percentage calculation spilling out of his mouth didn't belong to any 7-year-old child on earth. "How do you know that stuff?" Finn asked, her voice low. Jonah blinked. The brief confidence that had crossed his face disappeared, replaced by that familiar confusion. "I don't know. It just pops up. Like somebody is talking inside my head, but I can't see who it is." Then he looked down at his hands, turning over the stone he had picked up on the road that morning, and whispered, "Why does my head know things I don't remember learning?" Finn didn't answer. She just looked at him, at those large hands turning a tiny stone, at those innocent eyes that had just delivered a sharper business analysis than anyone she had ever met at the Greenfield market in 10 years, and Agnes's words echoed in her mind more clearly than ever before. "Inside him, there's something very strong asleep." Jonah began drawing sometime around the 3rd month. No one taught him. No one suggested it. One afternoon, Finn came back from the market and found him sitting on the living room floor, holding the pencil Agnes used to write down her medication list, drawing on the back of a sheet of herb wrapping paper. She was about to say something, but stopped the moment she saw the paper. The strokes were childlike, the lines uneven, the proportions off, but the detail was astonishing. He had drawn Brutus, and the dog in the picture had the exact number of wrinkles on his face, the exact way his ears drooped, the exact pose of lying with his head tilted and resting on his front paws the way Brutus always did. No ordinary 7-year-old child could draw like that. Agnes looked at the drawing and said nothing, but her eyes met Finn's, and both of them understood. Inside that damaged head, something was recovering, slowly, silently, like roots growing underground in winter soil. From that day on, Jonah drew every day. He drew the oak tree outside the door, drew Agnes in her wheelchair, drew the dented aluminum kettle, drew anything his eyes landed on. Finn bought him a pad of blank paper and a box of colored pencils from the dollar store in town, $2.75, and the way Jonah hugged the box of pencils to his chest when he received it was exactly the way a child would hold the first birthday gift of his life. Then one evening, while Finn was washing dishes, Jonah walked into the kitchen, stood behind her, and held out a sheet of paper. "For Sister Finn." She dried her hands and took it. It was a drawing of her standing in the vegetable garden, hair tied up high, a watering can in her hand, sunlight behind her. The lines were still clumsy, but there was something in the way he had drawn her, the way he had given more strokes to her face than to anything else in the picture, the way all the light in the drawing seemed to lean toward her. Underneath the drawing, in large, crooked, shaky handwriting, like that of a child just learning to write, "Finn Beautiful." Finn held the paper. Her fingers trembled slightly. She didn't look at him because she knew that if she looked up right then, something on her face would show, something she had no right to let show. "He has the mind of a 7-year-old child. Finn, this is innocent admiration. It's not what you're thinking. It isn't allowed to be what you're thinking." "Thank you, Jonah," she said, keeping her voice as normal as she could. "It's beautiful." He smiled brightly and ran off to show Agnes. Finn stayed there in the kitchen, still holding the drawing, looking at the two crooked words, Fin Beautiful, and reminded herself for the 10th time, the 20th time, the countless times she could no longer keep track of. It wasn't allowed. But the moments kept piling up without asking permission. The way Jonah quietly moved the larger portion into her bowl at every meal, whenever he thought she wasn't looking, even though she always was. The way he picked wildflowers by the roadside every morning on the way to market, said nothing, and simply set them on the table beside her basket of herbs. The way he sat on the porch in the evening, listening to Fin hum the folk song her mother used to sing when she was little, then sang along, getting every word wrong, getting the tune wrong too, but singing with such wholehearted devotion that Agnes had to cover her mouth in the other room to keep from laughing. Fin heard him singing it all wrong, and didn't correct him, because she was afraid that if she corrected him, he would stop, and she didn't want him to stop. And the very fact that she didn't want him to stop was the problem. Then, that night came. In the middle of the 4th month, Massachusetts was hit by the first storm of the season. Wind whistled through the cracks in the door. Rain battered the tin roof like war drums. Thunder rolled in the distance. Then the power went out. The wooden house sank into complete darkness. Jonah wasn't afraid. That surprised Fin because he had once been frightened by the soft sound of wind through the window. But tonight, maybe because he had grown used to things, maybe because some part of him was growing up without anyone noticing, he simply sat still in the chair, holding Brutus, calm. The one who was afraid tonight was Fin. She stood in the kitchen, one hand gripping the edge of the sink, her whole body gone stiff, not because of the darkness, not because of the thunder, but because 13 years earlier, the night her mother died had also been a stormy night. Fin had been 14, sitting beside the bed in the county hospital, holding her mother's thin hand, listening to the rain strike the hospital window while the heart monitor beeped more and more slowly, then more slowly still, until it became a flat line. Ever since then, every storm pulled her back to that night. She hadn't told anyone, not even Agnes. She had simply endured it, curled up in some corner, waiting for the storm to pass, then pretending to be normal the next morning. Tonight she slid down onto the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinet, her arms wrapped around her knees, biting her lip to keep the tears from falling. Thunder cracked. She flinched. The tears spilled out anyway, no matter how hard she tried. Then came the sound of footsteps. Light, slow, careful in the dark. Jonah sat down beside her. He said nothing. He didn't ask if Sister Fin was all right, didn't ask why she was crying, didn't ask any of the hundreds of questions he usually asked every day. He simply sat there, silent, in the darkness, close beside her. Then he placed a hand on her shoulder, gently, carefully, as though he knew exactly how much pressure was enough, exactly what moment was right, exactly that what she needed wasn't words but presence. And he said, his voice lower than usual, slower too, stripped of the rushed quality of a child. "You stayed beside me when I was scared. Now I'm staying beside you." Thunder sounded again. Rain still hammered the tin roof. But Fin didn't hear it anymore. She only heard those words, and she knew with the kind of instinct no reason could deny, that those words hadn't come from a 7-year-old child. A 7-year-old child wouldn't know how to sit silently when someone needed silence. A 7-year-old child wouldn't know how to place a hand on someone's shoulder with such careful gentleness. A 7-year-old child wouldn't have been able to say that sentence in that voice. Those were the words of a man. The man who was somewhere inside Jonah, deep beneath the injury, deep beneath the erased memory, still existed. And in this moment, he surfaced, just enough, for one sentence, then sank back down again. But one sentence was enough. Fin sat there in the darkness, her shoulder beneath his hand, her tears still falling but no longer because of her mother. And she knew. She was falling in love with this man, not out of pity, not out of loneliness, but because among all the people she had ever known, no one had ever sat down beside her in the dark and understood that all she needed was for someone to be there. And that, Fin knew more clearly than anyone, was more dangerous than any storm raging outside that house. The change came so gradually that Fin almost didn't notice it until it was standing right in front of her. By the 5th month, Jonah no longer asked, "What is this?" He asked, "How does this work?" His sentences grew longer, more complex, sometimes carrying a structure that made Fin pause for a few seconds, just to process what he had said. He still smiled with that same innocent sweetness, still liked slipping pretty stones into his pocket, still clung to the sleeve of her shirt whenever there were too many people around. But beneath that innocence, something was sharpening day by day, like a blade drawn again and again across stone, while the hand holding it had no idea what it was becoming. At the market, Jonah began helping Finn in ways no one had asked for, and no one had taught him. He rearranged the stall, pushing the lavender bundles to the front because purple catches the eye from farther away than green, grouping the herbal teas into sets of 3 instead of selling them one by one, because people like thinking they're getting a discount when they buy more, even if we're actually charging them higher overall, and placing the smallest packets at eye level because people buy what they see first, not what they need. Finn listened to him say these things in a calm, natural voice, as though this were obvious knowledge everyone in the world possessed. And every time he did, a chill ran over her skin, not because she was afraid of him, but because she was afraid of the question she didn't dare answer. Who had taught him these things before he forgot everything? But the moment that truly made Finn shiver came on Saturday morning of the 23rd week. Ray Holcomb, the wholesale herb buyer from Springfield, came to Finn's stall as he did every month. Ray was the kind of man Finn hated, but needed. He bought in bulk, paid cash, but always pressed the price down, and Finn didn't have enough other wholesale buyers to turn him away. That day, Ray looked over the goods, picked one up and smelled it, set it back down, and said, "Lower quality than last time. $3 a bundle, and I'll take the lot." Finn knew the goods weren't lower quality. She knew Ray knew they weren't lower quality, but she also knew that if she didn't sell to him, there wouldn't be enough money this weekend to buy Agnes's arthritis medicine. She was about to nod when Jonah stepped forward. He didn't say a word. He only moved to stand beside Finn and looked at Ray Holcomb. That look lasted maybe 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds, what Finn saw in Jonah's eyes wasn't innocence, wasn't confusion, wasn't the gaze of a 7-year-old child, or even a 12-year-old one. It was something else entirely. Cold, still, sharp. Those eyes looked at Ray Holcomb as if seeing straight through flesh and skin into bone, assessing, weighing, sorting, and deciding in an instant that the man standing before him wasn't frightening, wasn't worthy of respect, and was lying. Finn had never seen Jonah like that. Never. And she realized the hair on her arms had risen. Ray Holcomb felt it too. Finn saw the exact moment it happened. His shoulders pulled back slightly. His eyes blinked. The smug smile faded from his face. He didn't know why he suddenly felt uneasy. Didn't know why the survival instinct inside him had just sounded an alarm. But his body reacted before his mind could catch up. $4.50, Ray said, his voice completely different from 2 minutes earlier. Final price. Then he paid, took the goods, and left without haggling one more word. Finn grabbed Jonah's hand and pulled him behind the stall. Her heart was beating fast, not because of Ray, but because of that look. When she turned back to Jonah, he had already returned to normal, clear-eyed, head tilted, asking, "Sister Finn, what's wrong?" with a face of complete innocence. As though those 3 seconds had never happened. As though the person behind that cold gaze had stepped back inside, closed the door, and let innocent Jonah come out again in his place. She looked at him longer than usual. And for the first time in 6 months, the question Agnes had asked in the first week came back with 10 times the weight. "Who are you really?" Walt Briggs had watched that whole scene from the vegetable stand next door and missed nothing. But what he chose to comment on was something else entirely. When Finn returned to the stall, Walt leaned over, speaking loud enough for both of them to hear. "Finn, I'm telling you something. The way you two look at each other, the whole market already knows." Finn flushed. "Walt, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the truth. You look at that boy the way my wife looked at me back in '75, and the way he looks at you, don't even get me started. He looks at you like you're the sun, and he's never seen light before. You're drunk, Walt." "I haven't had a drop since morning, and you know I'm right." Finn didn't answer. She knew Walt was right. The whole market knew, probably except Jonah. Or maybe Jonah knew too in the way his mind understood things, not through language or concepts, but through the purest instinct of all. That afternoon, after the market, the two of them sat on the front steps of the wooden house. Brutus lay at their feet, breathing steadily. Sunset poured over the row of oaks in a deep orange glow, the kind of light New England only had in late spring when the days grew longer and the sky wasn't in a hurry to turn dark. Jonah was quiet longer than usual. He didn't ask questions, didn't point things out, didn't talk about a new stone he'd found or a new bird he'd seen. He only sat there looking toward the woods, and when he finally spoke, his voice was deeper, slower, closer to something Finn had only heard in flashes during the stormy night, but this time clearer, longer, more real. "I don't remember who I am," he said. "I don't remember where I came from. I don't remember what I used to do. But I know one thing." She looked at him. "I want to stay here. With you. Forever." It wasn't the voice of a child. It wasn't an impulsive sentence. It was the voice of someone who had thought, considered, and understood the weight of every word. Finn didn't answer. She looked ahead, to where the sunset was slowly swallowing the line of oaks, and felt his hand shift a little closer across the wooden step, his fingers brushing hers, light, hesitant, as if he was afraid too. She didn't pull her hand away. He didn't pull his away. Their hands rested side by side on the old wooden step, fingertip touching fingertip, in silence, and both of them knew that the boundary Finn had fought to keep for 6 months had just been erased by the distance between two fingertips. 6 months. Long enough for a poor girl to fall in love with a man with no past. Long enough for a man with no past to find a reason not to need his memory, but not long enough to keep a secret forever. Because hundreds of miles away, there were eyes that had never stopped searching. While Jonah sat on the porch of the wooden house in Greenfield, learning how to crack eggshells, in Boston, the DeLuca empire was bleeding out. 6 months without Raven was 6 months in which everything he had built over 12 years began to fracture from within. Conrad Vale was the first to arrive at the crash site, 3 hours after the police found the wrecked car. He stood at the edge of the road, looking down at the broken guardrail, the ravine below, the twisted heap of metal being hauled up, and when the police said, "No body was found," most of the world heard those words and assumed Raven was dead, that his remains had been dragged away by wild animals or washed off in the rain. Conrad heard those words and thought, no body means not dead. He knew Raven. He knew how hard that man was to kill. At 25, his father had been shot dead right in front of him. 7 different organizations had tried to swallow the DeLuca empire in the 3 months that followed, and Raven hadn't just held the throne, he had doubled the territory within a single year. A man like that didn't die from one fall into a ravine. Conrad began his private investigation in the very first week. He sent men to check every hospital within a 100-mile radius of the crash, every private clinic, every morgue. He hired investigators to comb through traffic camera footage along Interstate 91, searching for the 2 black SUVs he knew hadn't just happened to be there that night by chance. He didn't find Raven, but he also didn't find proof that Raven was dead. And to Conrad, those weren't the same thing. Perry Gaines was the opposite. In the first week after the crash, Perry played the grieving second in command. He wore black suits, lowered his voice, and offered condolences to Catherine DeLuca, Raven's mother, with words measured so perfectly they felt weighed on a scale. But by the 2nd week, Perry was already sitting in Raven's chair in the meeting room. By the 2nd month, he had begun signing new agreements in the name of the interim leadership. By the 3rd month, he met with Victor Kovac. The meeting took place at a seafood restaurant in South Boston, neutral territory, outside both DeLuca and Kovac control. Perry sat across from Victor, the 55-year-old Eastern European boss with silver hair slicked back and gray eyes as cold as the winter in Minsk where he had been born. The deal Raven had rejected that night was now reopened by Perry, but not as an alliance, as submission. Perry gave Kovac access to part of the DeLuca shipping routes to distribute drugs across New England, and in return, Kovac helped Perry consolidate power and eliminate anyone inside the DeLuca organization bold enough to challenge his new position. Money began flowing in a different direction. Accounts Raven had controlled in secret were transferred to new names. Old agreements were torn up and replaced with fresh contracts bearing Perry's signature and Kovac's seal. The DeLuca empire didn't collapse. It was devoured from the inside by the very man Raven had once trusted enough to sit at his table. Conrad knew it. Not all of it, but enough. He saw money disappearing from the accounts. He saw unfamiliar faces appearing in meetings that had once been reserved for DeLuca men alone. He saw the way Perry looked at him whenever he asked questions, the look of someone calculating when this threat would need to be handled. Conrad didn't confront him directly, because he wasn't stupid. Standing alone against Perry and Kovac together was suicide. He needed Raven, so he kept searching. By the 4th month, Perry called an internal council and proposed that Raven DeLuca be officially declared dead. 6 months without a sign of life, Perry said, his voice calm, his gold glasses catching the light. This organization needs stability. It needs clear leadership. We can't keep waiting for a ghost forever. Conrad sat at the far end of the table, his jaw clenched tight. No body means no death. That's the rule. That's emotion, Conrad, not strategy. The tension in the room was thick enough to slice through with a knife. Perry's side was larger, stronger, backed by Kovac money. Conrad's side was smaller, but they were the men who had followed Raven from the beginning and refused to bow to someone they knew was nothing more than an accountant who had learned how to betray. The vote was delayed because Conrad threatened that if they declared Raven dead without proof, he would take the matter straight to Catherine DeLuca, and no one in that room wanted to face that woman once her anger rose. Perry stepped back, for the moment, but Conrad knew it was only a matter of time. Then the call came. In the 6th month, on an ordinary Saturday, Conrad's phone vibrated. Tommy Vega, 26 years old, a low-level runner handling deliveries for a minor route in western Massachusetts. Tommy wasn't important, just the last link in a long chain, the kind of man Perry probably didn't even remember by name. But Tommy remembered Raven DeLuca's face, because 2 years earlier, at the only year-end meeting the full organization had ever been called to attend, Tommy had stood in the back row and watched Raven walk to the front and speak, and he had never forgotten that face. "Mr. Vale?" Tommy said over the phone, his voice caught halfway between excitement and panic. "I know this is going to sound crazy, but I'm at the farmer's market in Greenfield, and I swear to you, I just saw the boss." Conrad stopped everything. "Say that again." "Raven DeLuca. He's here, right in front of me. About 50 meters away. He's wearing a flannel shirt. His hair's longer than before. But that face, I can't be wrong. He's standing here. He's smiling, Mr. Val. He's standing beside a girl and a dog the size of a calf. And I think he's selling lavender." Silence on the line. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Conrad took one long, slow breath. The kind of breath a man takes when he realizes that for 6 months he hadn't been wrong. For 6 months he hadn't been losing his mind. For 6 months his instincts had been right. "Tommy, listen to me. Send the exact location. Take pictures if you can, but don't get close. Don't speak to him. Don't let him see you." "Yes, sir. And Tommy, this is the most important part. Don't tell anyone, especially Perry." Tommy hesitated. "Why not, Perry?" Conrad looked out the office window toward Boston Harbor, where 6 months earlier he had stood at the edge of that broken guardrail and sworn he would find the truth. "Because I still don't know who pushed the boss into that ravine that night. But I know one thing for certain. The person who did it is sitting very close to us." 3 days after Tommy Vega's call, Conrad Vale drove to Greenfield alone. He brought no one with him because he still didn't know for certain who inside the organization could be trusted. He parked half a mile from Finn's house, walked in on foot, watched from a distance, and when he saw the man sitting on the steps of that shabby wooden house, wearing an oversized flannel shirt, holding a dog the size of a calf and laughing because the dog was licking his face, Conrad Vale stood there among the oak trees and had to brace his back against a trunk because his knees nearly gave out beneath him. It was Raven. There was no doubt. That face, that build, the faint scar on his neck that Conrad knew well because he himself had driven Raven to the hospital the night he was stabbed at 22. But that smile, Conrad had never seen that smile before. In 12 years beside Raven DeLuca, he had never once seen that man laugh like that. Laugh without calculation, without purpose. Laugh simply because he was happy and knew no other reason for it. Conrad pulled back, drove all the way to Boston, and spent 2 days preparing. He called Catherine DeLuca and said 3 words to her. "Your son lives." She stayed silent on the line for 15 seconds, then said only one sentence, "Take me to him." That morning in Greenfield began like every other morning. Finn woke before dawn, made tea for Agnes, arranged the herbs in baskets even though it wasn't a market day. Jonah sat on the porch with Brutus, scribbling in his drawing pad, every now and then looking up to ask Finn the name of the bird that had just flown by. Agnes drank tea in the kitchen while the old radio played country music. Peaceful. The kind of peace Finn knew was fragile, but still tried to hold on to with both hands. Then the sound of engines came, not one vehicle, several, heavy, steady, drawing nearer along the red dirt road where strange cars almost never came. Finn stepped onto the porch, still holding a dish towel, and frowned. Brutus rose to his feet, ears pricked, the fur along his neck lifting. Jonah stopped drawing. The pencil slipped from his hand. 5 black SUVs, polished and gleaming, appeared one by one at the end of the road, and stopped in front of the wooden house. The engines shut off. Silence pressed down so hard it was almost suffocating. Then the doors opened. Conrad Vale stepped out of the first vehicle. Black suit, close-cut hair, eyes sweeping the area out of professional instinct before stopping at the porch. He looked at Raven. Raven looked at him, and Conrad saw the thing Tommy had described, but he hadn't believed until that moment. The eyes of his boss were no longer the eyes he knew. They were frightened. Jonah hurried to his feet, stepped back, and hid behind Finn, both hands clinging tightly to her shoulders from behind. "Sister Finn, who are those people? I'm scared." His voice shook, truly shook, and the way he hid behind a girl nearly 40 kilos lighter than he was made Conrad swallow hard and turn his face away for a second, because he didn't want anyone to see the wetness in his eyes. Then the second car door opened. Catherine DeLuca stepped out, 63 years old, silver hair pinned high, back straight, footsteps steady. A woman who had once stood beside her husband through the bloodiest years of the DeLuca Empire and had never once trembled. But when her eyes landed on the face of the man hiding behind a strange girl, she stopped. Her feet wouldn't move again. Her hand rose to cover her mouth, and Catherine DeLuca, the woman the whole Boston underworld feared, collapsed to her knees in the middle of that red dirt yard. "My son," her voice broke. It wasn't a call. It was a sob forced into words. Jonah clutched Finn's shoulders harder. "I don't know her. Sister Finn, I don't know her." Conrad signaled for a guard to bring him a tablet. He stepped onto the porch, keeping his distance, and turned the screen toward Jonah. On it was a photograph. Raven DeLuca in a black suit, standing in front of headquarters, eyes cold as steel. Then a video. Raven walking into a meeting room, everyone rising to their feet. Then a news article. "Most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast. The DeLuca underworld empire. Missing after fatal crash." Jonah stared at the screen. He stared at the face in the photograph. The same face he saw every morning when Finn handed him a mirror to comb his hair. But the eyes in the photograph were completely different. Cold, dark, terrifying. "That person," Jonah whispered, shaking his head. "That person is scary. I'm not that person." Finn stood motionless. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, reading every headline. "Mafia boss. Underworld empire. Linked to multiple acts of violence." Her hand slowly slipped from the doorframe. Her chest tightened until breathing hurt. 6 months. 6 months of caring for him, making porridge, teaching him how to separate eggshells, holding his hand through stormy nights, loving him, and the man she loved was a mafia boss. Jonah felt the change. His instincts, even the instincts of a child, were sharp enough to sense the moment Finn pulled away. Not with her feet, but with something deeper, with the way her breathing changed, with the way her shoulders stiffened beneath his hands. He stepped out from behind her, moved around to stand in front of her, and looked straight into her face, his eyes red and wet. "Sister Finn, please don't leave me." Finn swallowed her tears, swallowed so hard that her throat hurt. "You should go with them, Jonah. They're your family. That's your mother." "No." He shook his head violently, tears flying free. "You are my family. You and Agnes and Brutus. I don't know those people. I don't want to go." Then came the sound of wheels from inside the house. Agnes pushed herself out to the doorway, looked at the line of black cars, looked at the men in suits, looked at the woman kneeling in the yard and crying, looked at her granddaughter trying not to shatter, and looked at the man she had thought of as an adopted son for the past 6 months. Then she spoke, her voice calm, slow, each word carrying the weight of a woman who had lived 74 years and feared no one. "If you truly are his people, then prove you're worthy of taking him away. Because for 6 months, only my granddaughter and this dog kept him alive. Where were you for those 6 months?" Conrad looked at her. Then he bowed his head. Not a polite dip of the chin, but a real bow, deep, the kind a man gives when he knows he owes a debt he can never repay. "Ma'am, we owe you more than we can say, and we'll never forget it." 20 minutes later, Jonah was sitting in the car. Not because he wanted to, but because Finn told him he should go, and Finn was the only person in the world he obeyed. But from the moment he stepped off the porch until the moment he sat down in the back seat, he never let go of Finn's hand. She walked beside him all the way to the car door, and in that final instant, When he had to step in, and she had to let go, his fingers held hers so tightly that she felt pain. But she didn't pull away. She accepted the pain until distance finally forced their hands apart. The door closed. The line of SUVs began to roll forward. Brutus lunged from the porch and ran after the lead vehicle, all four heavy legs pumping without stopping, barking over and over, chasing them down the red dirt road until the cars picked up speed and the distance widened more and more. The dog stopped in the middle of the road and watched the convoy grow smaller, then disappear around the bend. He stood there, tail hanging low, no longer barking. On the porch, Finn didn't cry. She stood there with both hands at her sides, staring at the empty road. Agnes rolled up beside her, said nothing for a long while, then took her granddaughter's hand, her wrinkled fingers closing around the calloused hand, and said softly, "You haven't lost him, Finn. You're only lending him out." The penthouse sat on the 32nd floor of a building overlooking Boston Harbor, all glass and steel, minimalist interior, every object in the apartment worth more than everything Finn owned put together. But to Jonah, it was hell. The elevator was the first thing. When the steel doors closed and the floor began to tremble beneath him, Jonah backed into the corner, both hands gripping the rail, eyes squeezed shut, breathing fast. Conrad stood beside him, not knowing what to do, because in 12 years he had never once seen Raven DeLuca afraid of anything, and now that same man was shrinking into himself in an elevator, terrified of the feeling of the floor dropping away beneath his feet. The noise of the city was the next thing. Horns, engines, voices, construction, all of it crashed into Jonah's ears at once, like a wall of water, and he covered his ears, turning in circles, searching for the thing he always searched for whenever he was afraid. Finn. But Finn wasn't here. And every time he realized that, his eyes broke all over again. The people in suits were the last thing. Bodyguards, assistants, lawyers, all of them looking at him with respectful eyes, bowing their heads, calling him boss or Mr. DeLuca. Jonah didn't understand why they called him that. He didn't want them looking at him. He didn't want to be here. He wanted to go back to the wooden house, wanted to hear the floorboards creak, wanted to smell the dry lavender on the kitchen table, wanted Brutus lying at his feet, wanted Finn. Dr. Owen Nash came on the second day, 50 years old, salt and pepper hair, a neurologist who had worked quietly for the DeLuca family for more than 15 years, the only one outside a formal hospital Catherine trusted. He examined Jonah in the master bedroom of the penthouse, gentle, patient, the way one would examine a child, because in truth that was exactly what he was dealing with. After 2 hours of neurological, cognitive, reflex, and memory testing, Dr. Nash sat down with Catherine and Conrad in the living room, his voice slow and measured. Severe frontal lobe damage, clear cognitive regression. His current intellectual functioning fluctuates around the level of a child of 10 to 12, with signs of gradual recovery. His long-term memory is completely blocked, but it hasn't been destroyed, which means the memories are still there. The brain just hasn't opened the door to them yet, Catherine asked, her voice tightly controlled. Will he return to normal? It's possible, but no one knows when or how much of him will return. And there's one thing I need to stress. Don't force him. Don't force memory. Don't force adult behavior. Don't pressure him. If you do, the damage could become permanent. Catherine nodded, but not forcing him turned out to be harder than she expected. She loved her son in the only way she knew how. The way of a woman who had spent her life in a world where love was measured by the things money could buy. She brought home expensive clothes, and Jonah refused to wear them because they weren't soft like Sister Finn's flannel shirt. She bought watches, shoes, electronic devices, and Jonah didn't touch them. He only sat there looking at them, then turned away. She hired a chef to prepare fine meals, and Jonah ate a few bites, then pushed the plate aside and said, "It doesn't taste as good as the porridge Sister Finn makes." Every day, with perfect regularity, Jonah asked the same question. In the morning he asked Conrad, "When is Sister Finn coming?" At noon he asked Catherine, "Did Sister Finn call?" At night he sat alone by the window looking out at a city he didn't recognize, hugging a pillow, and asked the darkness, "Where is Sister Finn?" Conrad couldn't answer, Catherine couldn't answer, and Jonah never stopped asking. Then Perry Gaines came. 2 weeks after Raven had been brought back to Boston, Perry appeared at the penthouse with a bouquet of flowers, a bottle of wine, and a smile that Catherine found comforting, and Conrad found venomous. "I want to visit the boss," Perry said, his voice just sorrowful enough, just worried enough, just sincere enough to fool anyone who didn't know the truth. Conrad let him in, but stood close behind, his eyes never leaving him. Perry stepped into the living room and saw Raven DeLuca, the boss he had paid to have killed 6 months earlier, sitting on the floor with both legs stretched out, working on a dog puzzle Catherine had bought at a children's toy store. Jonah didn't look up. He was trying to fit the dog's ear into the right place, tongue peeking out in concentration, completely unaware of the presence of the man who had nearly killed him half a year earlier. Perry looked at that scene. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, then he turned away, and in the instant, his face slipped out of Conrad's view, out of Catherine's view, out of everyone's view. A smile flickered across Perry Gaines's mouth, a smile no one saw, but if anyone had, they would have understood its nature at once. Relief. Not relief because the boss was alive, but relief because the thing sitting on the floor wasn't a threat. Better than dead, Perry thought. Alive, but useless. 2 weeks later, Perry called an internal council. This time he didn't propose, declaring Raven dead. He proposed something worse, declaring Raven cognitively incompetent, unfit to lead, and transferring all authority to an interim leadership board, with Perry at its head. "We've all seen his condition," Perry said, his voice low with practiced sorrow, his gold glasses catching the light. "He sits on the floor doing puzzles all day. He's afraid of elevators. He doesn't remember his own name. This isn't disrespect. It's reality. The organization needs a capable leader, and right now, Raven isn't that man." Conrad stood up, both hands planted on the table, eyes fixed directly on Perry. "You sat in his chair before he was even cold. You signed a deal with Kovac while the ink on the papers searching for him still wasn't dry. And now you want to strip him of power by a vote in the meeting room he built? No, not while I'm still breathing." The room split in two. Perry's side was larger now, swollen by the men bought with Kovac money over the last 6 months. Conrad's side was smaller, but it was the old backbone of the empire, the men who had followed Raven from the beginning and would follow him to the end. The vote was delayed again, but both sides knew it was only a matter of time. Perry had money, Conrad had loyalty. And between those two things, history had proved again and again that money often won. That evening, Conrad sat in his car in the penthouse parking area, looking out at the city lights, then dialed a number he had copied from Agnes Dawson's records at Franklin County Hospital when he quietly checked before the trip to Greenfield. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered. "Who is this?" Finn's voice, tired, guarded. "Miss Dawson, this is Conrad Vale, the one who came to take Jonah, to take Raven last week." Silence. "How is he?" Conrad took a breath. "He asks about you. Every day. Every morning. Every afternoon. Every night. He hasn't finished a single meal since he left Greenfield, and someone is trying to take everything from him while he sits on the floor doing puzzles." The silence stretched longer. "Why are you calling me?" "Because he needs you, and because I think you need to know." A breath came from the other end of the line, long and shaking, then the sound of the call ending. Not one word. In Greenfield, inside the wooden house that was now missing one person, Finley Dawson sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet, the phone face down in her lap, and cried. The first memory came back at 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 weeks after Jonah had been brought back to Boston. He was sleeping on the king-size bed in the master bedroom of the penthouse. A bed so wide that he always curled himself into one corner as though he were afraid the empty space might swallow him, when he suddenly jolted upright, eyes wide open, mouth parted, unable to breathe. Inside his head, an image had just exploded like a flare. A dark room, the smell of gunpowder, a man's face looking up at him, eyes pleading, lips moving, then the gunshot. Jonah screamed. The scream tore through the night of the penthouse, echoing through the apartment of glass and steel. The kind of scream that came from someone who had just seen something the mind refused to accept. Catherine rushed into the room, turned on the light, and found her son sitting in the middle of the bed, both hands clutching his head, his whole body shaking, sweat soaking through his sleep shirt. "Raven? My son, what's wrong?" He didn't hear her. His eyes were open, but they weren't seeing the room. They were seeing memory, and memory was black. She held him tight, and Jonah cried in his mother's arms without knowing she was his mother. Cried because he had just seen himself kill a man for the first time and couldn't understand why he had been there, why his hand had been holding that thing, why that face had been so afraid of him. From that night on, memory came back like the tide. Not in a steady current, but in waves, irregular, violent, without warning. Some waves were images, meeting rooms, long tables, men in suits looking at him in fear. Some waves were sounds, shattering glass, someone screaming, the sound of blood dripping onto a concrete floor. Some waves were only smells, gunpowder, whiskey, leather, expensive cologne. And beneath it all, the smell of other people's fear, the smell Raven DeLuca had once known so well that he no longer recognized it as something separate. Every wave of memory came with a savage headache, the kind of pain that felt as though someone were driving nails into his temples from the inside. Jonah screamed, broke things, threw whatever was within reach. The crystal vase Catherine had set on the shelf shattered on the 3rd day. The bathroom mirror cracked on the 5th day. The armchair was overturned on the 7th day. Each time, Catherine ran in, held him, steadied him, and each time, she saw something in Jonah's eyes beginning to change, not becoming better or worse, but something old, coming back to life, like paint being slowly scraped away to reveal the picture underneath, and she wasn't sure she wanted to see what that picture was. Dr. Nash came to examine him every week. He said this was a normal part of recovery, that the brain was reopening the doors of memory one by one, and it would hurt, it would be chaotic, but it shouldn't be interrupted. Let him remember, he said, no matter how frightening what he remembers may be. But in the darkness, in the waves of blood-soaked and violent memory, one image always returned, steadily, gently, like a candle in the middle of a storm. Finn, her smile when she carried a bowl of porridge into the room, her voice when she said, "It's okay, it's only the wind." Her hand holding his in the stormy night, while the whole wooden house trembled beneath the force of the wind. Her eyes when she looked at him, that kind of look he had no words to describe, but knew no one had ever looked at him that way before. At least no one in the torrent of memory flooding back through him. The memories of Finn didn't hurt. They came softly, warmly, and every time they came, the headache eased, his breathing slowed, his hands stopped shaking. It was as though inside the chaos tearing his head apart, Finn was the only thing still intact, not yet stained by the old memories, not yet swallowed by the dark. Then that night came, the 5th week in Boston. Jonah lay on the bed, eyes closed, but not asleep. In his head, a memory was opening, slowly, more clearly than any memory before it. Rain, the highway, hands gripping the wheel, the phone buzzing, a distorted voice through Bluetooth. "You should have taken the deal, DeLuca." He sat upright at once. His breathing turned sharp. But this time, he didn't scream. This time, something else was happening inside his mind. That sentence. The deal. The Kovac deal. Perry had presented the Kovac deal that night in the wine cellar. Raven refused. Left the meeting. Drove onto Interstate 91. The call came. "You should have taken the deal." Less than 4 hours after he said no. Who knew he had refused? Who knew his schedule that night? Who knew he would be driving alone on Interstate 91? Conrad knew the schedule, but Conrad had wanted him in a car with a driver. Conrad had complained about him driving alone. Conrad would have never put him in a position to be alone on the road if he had meant to harm him. Perry knew the schedule. Perry knew about the deal. Perry knew Raven would refuse because Perry knew Raven well enough to predict the answer. And Perry was the only one besides Kovac who knew the details of the arrangement well enough to use the phrase, "the deal," in that threatening call. Jonah lay back against the bed, staring at the ceiling. But the eyes looking at the ceiling were no longer Jonah's eyes. They weren't frightened. They weren't innocent. They weren't confused. They were cold. Still. Sharp, like the surface of frozen water with a current underneath, strong enough to drag anything away. He picked up the phone and dialed Conrad's number. 2:37 in the morning. Conrad answered on the first ring because Conrad Vale hadn't slept deeply once since Raven disappeared. Boss? Silence for 3 seconds. Then the voice came through the line, and Conrad felt the hair rise along his arms, because that voice wasn't Jonah's voice. It wasn't the trembling voice that asked when Sister Finn was coming. It was the voice Conrad had heard for 12 years. Low, slow, each word heavy as lead. "Perry. It's Perry." Conrad closed his eyes, drew in one long breath. When he opened them, His voice was completely calm, the kind of calm possessed by a man who had waited 6 months for this exact moment and had finally reached it. "I know, boss. I'm waiting for your orders." Silence on the line. The sound of breathing, even, slow, controlled. Then one word. "Not yet." And Conrad understood. Not yet didn't mean no. Not yet meant the Raven was coming back. But in his own way, on his own timing. Not yet meant Perry Gaines would pay. But not tonight. Tonight, Raven only needed to know one thing. He remembered now. And the traitor didn't know that he remembered. That was the most dangerous weapon the Raven had ever possessed. 3 weeks after the call at 2 a.m, Raven DeLuca had recovered enough to know exactly who he was, what he wanted, and what he was going to do to the man who had tried to kill him. But the world around him didn't know that, because Raven didn't allow them to know. In front of Catherine, he was still Jonah, a little slower, a little calmer, screaming less, but still sitting on the floor doing puzzles, still asking, "When is Sister Finn coming?" Still afraid of elevators. In front of Dr. Nash, he intentionally answered some of the cognitive tests incorrectly. Just enough for the doctor to note, slow but positive recovery. And in front of Perry Gaines, whenever Perry came to the penthouse to check on the situation with his fake smile and prepackaged concerned voice, Raven sat on the floor, eyes clear, pencil in hand, scribbling nonsense, occasionally looking up with a foolish smile. He acted. He acted perfectly, because if 12 years on the DeLuca throne had taught him anything, it was this. The most dangerous weapon wasn't a gun, but an enemy who didn't know he was being targeted. At night, when the penthouse was quiet, Raven changed completely. He sat at the desk in his private room, the door locked. The tablet Conrad had secretly brought him glowing in the dark. Conrad sent him everything. The financial records from the past 6 months, account movements, the money transferred offshore through shell companies Perry had created, the contracts signed with Kovac, call logs, emails, encrypted messages that Conrad's tech team had spent 2 weeks cracking. Raven read all of it. He read slowly, because his head still hurt when he concentrated too long, and there were still moments when the words on the screen blurred, and he had to close his eyes, breathe, then open them and read again. There were still times when he forgot what he was doing, when his mind slipped back into Jonah's state for a few seconds, and then returned, like a light flickering before it held steady. Dr. Nash said he had recovered about 85%, but the remaining 15% might never come back, and Raven accepted that because 85% of the Raven was still more than 100% of most people in the room he was about to walk into. The council meeting took place on Thursday of the 8th week, in the large boardroom on the 20th floor, where 14 men sat around the black oak table Raven himself had installed 10 years earlier. Perry sat at the head of the table, Raven's seat, gold glasses gleaming, a thick stack of documents in front of him. Each page another nail driven deeper into the coffin of the old boss. Today, Perry would present the formal proposal to strip Raven DeLuca of power on the grounds of permanent cognitive incapacity, transfer full control to himself, legalize every agreement with Kovac, and lock Conrad and the loyal faction out of power forever. "You've all seen his condition," Perry began, his voice deep with carefully rehearsed sorrow. "I don't want to be standing here any more than any of you do, but we have to face the truth." The boardroom door opened. Perry stopped speaking. 14 heads turned. Raven DeLuca walked in. Not Jonah. A black 3-piece suit, tailored to perfection. The kind of suit where every stitch spoke of power before the man wearing it even opened his mouth. Hair slicked back, immaculate. Back straight. Footsteps even, slow. Each one echoing across the wooden floor in total silence. But what froze the room wasn't the suit or the way he walked. It was his eyes. The eyes the 14 men in this room had once known and once feared. Cold, sharp, cutting across every face they passed over like a surgical blade through flesh. Perry Gaines looked into those eyes and the blood drained from his face. Raven didn't sit down. He stood at the head of the table, directly in front of Perry, and set down a thick file, opened it. First page. A copy of the transfer from a DeLuca account into a shell company in Delaware that Perry had established 4 months earlier. Second page. The communication logs between Perry and Victor Kovac. Every call, every date, every minute. Third page. The contract dividing the shipping routes, signed by Perry and bearing Kovac's seal. Fourth page. An analysis of the Interstate 91 route on the night of the crash. 2 SUVs rented through a private security company owned by Kovac, paid for through an account authorized by Perry. Every dollar, every call, every lie, all of it lay on the table, under the lights, in front of 14 pairs of eyes. Perry looked at the stack of evidence, looked up at Raven. His mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in his life, Perry Gaines couldn't find the right thing to say because there was no right thing to say for this moment. Raven looked at him. Not angry, not shouting. His voice was so calm it turned cold, each word landing on the table heavier than the stack of evidence itself. "You wanted my throne, Perry? Then you should have remembered this. The man who sits on that throne has to be ready to die for it. I've already died once. What about you?" Perry didn't answer. No one answered. The boardroom stayed silent for 15 seconds, the kind of silence in which everyone in the room understood that whatever happened next to Perry Gaines wouldn't happen in this room. There would be no witnesses, and no one would ask questions. Conrad stood up, walked behind Perry, and placed a hand on his shoulder. Only placed a hand on his shoulder. But Perry understood. Everyone understood. He rose to his feet, legs shaking, and followed Conrad out the door. Not a word. The door closed. No one in the boardroom asked where Perry Gaines went after that afternoon. No one ever did. The following week, Victor Kovac received a wooden crate delivered to his office in Providence, Rhode Island. Inside was nothing but Perry Gaines's gold-rimmed glasses and a handwritten card with 4 words, "Consider this a warning." Kovac understood. He pulled his men out of New England within a month, without needing a single additional call. Raven reclaimed the empire in one afternoon. But that very night, after the boardroom emptied, after Conrad handled everything that needed handling, after Catherine held her son and cried because she realized her son had truly come back, Raven stood alone in the penthouse looking out at Boston Harbor glittering with lights, and he felt no victory. He felt empty. He picked up his car keys, stepped into the elevator that Jonah had been terrified of 6 weeks earlier, drove out of Boston, and turned onto Interstate 91 heading west, heading toward Greenfield, heading toward Finn. Raven drove for 2 straight hours without stopping, and reached Greenfield just as the morning had fully broken. He turned onto the familiar red dirt road, passed between the 2 rows of old oak trees, reached the end of the road, and stopped the car. The wooden house was there, still there, but it was empty. The front door was shut but unlocked, and the rusty hinge that he had once fixed with a screwdriver and Jonah's clumsy determination had come loose again. He stepped inside. The scent of dried lavender still lingered, but it was old now, the smell of something left behind, not something still being cared for. The kitchen was clean, the table was bare, the wooden chair where he had sat every evening by the window was still in the same place, but a thin layer of dust covered it. In the bedroom, the bed where Finn had stayed awake for 3 nights in a row to keep him alive, was neatly made with folded white sheets. No pillow, no blanket, no sign of life. The shoe rack by the door no longer held Finn's rubber boots. The kitchen shelf no longer held Agnes's tea tin. The corner of the living room no longer held the old cushion where Brutus had slept every night. They were gone. Raven stood in the middle of the empty house, his hand resting on the wooden tabletop, the place where Jonah had once sat drawing pictures, where Finn had once arranged herbs every morning, where Agnes had once set down her cup of tea and laughed when he fell out of the chair because of the television. 8 weeks ago, this house had been everything he knew about the world. Now it was only 4 wooden walls and silence. He drove to the Greenfield market. Saturday morning. The market was crowded, exactly the hour when Finn used to arrive. The corner stall at the end of the row beside the vegetable stand sat empty. No baskets of lavender, no tea packets. "No, Finn." Raven walked straight to Walt Briggs's stand. Walt was arranging bunches of kale on the shelf, his old baseball cap faded, his apron dirty, his hands moving quickly. When he looked up at the man standing in front of the stand, he didn't recognize Jonah. The man before him wasn't the large man who had once clung to the sleeve of a tiny girl and trembled in crowds. The man Walt had laughed about. This man stood straight, shoulders open, eyes cold, wearing a fitted black coat, and his whole presence gave off something that made Walt, 60 years old, and no stranger to life, take half a step backward without understanding why. "Where is Finn?" 2 words. His voice was low, clipped. But on the second word, something cracked. Not loudly, not clearly, only the tiniest fracture in his voice, so small that Walt might have missed it if he hadn't been paying attention. But Walt was paying attention, and he recognized that fracture. It was Jonah's fracture, the fracture of the man who had once stood behind Finn Dawson shaking when a stranger raised his voice. "Good Lord," Walt whispered. "Jonah?" Raven didn't answer. He only looked at him and waited. Walt looked back for a long moment, trying to piece together the man standing in front of him with the man in his memory, and then he understood that both were the same person, and whoever Jonah truly was, the answer lay somewhere beyond his understanding. "Finn sold the house about 6 weeks ago," Walt said, his voice low. "Miss Agnes was admitted to the hospital, a lot sicker than anyone realized. Her knees got worse, then kidney failure, then dialysis, and the hospital bills ate through everything. The girl sold the house, sold everything she had, and moved to Springfield. I've got the address because I send her some vegetables every week. It's the only thing I can do for her." He wrote the address on the back of a produce receipt and handed it to Raven. "She's thin," Walt added when Raven turned away. "Thinner than when you were here. You know her. She won't tell anybody she's struggling. She'll just endure it." Raven took the paper, nodded once, and walked away. Walt watched him go and shook his head. The apartment in Springfield was on the 3rd floor of an old red brick building in the south side of town. The kind of building where the stairwell smelled of mildew and the hallway lights flickered. Raven stood in front of apartment 37 and knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Footsteps inside, slow, tired. The door opened. Finn stood there, thinner, dark shadows beneath her eyes, hair tied up in haste, an old oversized t-shirt, slippers. 2 months since the last time he had seen her, and those 2 months had taken more from her than the previous 6 combined. She looked at him, not surprised, not frightened, not happy. She only looked, with the kind of look that belonged to someone too exhausted to react strongly to anything anymore. Then from deeper inside the apartment came the sound of nails tapping against tile. Brutus appeared at the end of the narrow hallway. Older now, slower, his muzzle grayer. The dog stopped. He sniffed. His whole body went rigid. Then he lunged forward. 65 kilos of gray-black fur barreled down the hallway, tail whipping wildly, muzzle lifted, a broken whimper rising from his throat, the kind of sound Finn hadn't heard from Brutus since the day the line of black SUVs had taken Jonah away. The dog jumped up, both front paws landing against Raven's chest, his muzzle burying into Raven's neck, licking without stopping, tail wagging so hard his whole body shook with it. Raven held the dog, held him tightly. He buried his face into the dog's wrinkled gray fur and closed his eyes. And if Finn had looked closely, she would have seen his shoulders trembling. But she didn't look closely. She leaned against the doorframe, folded her arms across her chest, and waited. When Raven straightened again, his eyes slightly red, he looked at her. She looked back. "You've remembered everything. Not a question. Yes. So you know who you are. I know who I used to be, and I know who I want to be." Silence. Finn looked at him, looked at the expensive black coat, looked at the car parked below on the street, worth more than the whole building she now lived in, looked at the way he stood, straight and steady, nothing like Jonah who had once hidden behind her back. "I don't belong in your world, Raven." The first time she had called him by his real name, and it hurt more than any punch he had ever taken. "I live here," she continued. "I do laundry for other people. I sell herbs when I have herbs to sell. I take care of my grandmother. I'm not made for black SUVs and a penthouse on the 32nd floor." Raven stepped forward. One step. Only one. And when he spoke, his voice shook. Raven DeLuca, the man who had just sat at the head of a boardroom table and looked at Perry Gaines with eyes that made 14 men afraid to breathe, was now standing in front of a thin 27-year-old girl in a rundown apartment in Springfield, with a tremor in his voice. "You saved me when you didn't know who I was. You gave me a name when I had none. You held my hand when I was afraid of the dark. You taught me how to separate eggshells." He swallowed. "I could buy this whole city, Finn, but I can't buy what you gave me. No one sells that." Finn didn't look away. She looked straight into his eyes. Eyes she had once seen frightened like a child's, once seen innocent while drawing pictures, once seen flash cold in the market, and now looking at her with something she knew well, because she was looking at him with the same thing. Tears spilled over, not the kind she hid in the kitchen, hid behind cabinets, hid from Agnes, hid from the whole world. This was the kind of crying she hadn't allowed herself since the night her mother died in the county hospital 13 years ago, the kind with no hiding, no holding back, no shame, rising from a place deep in her chest that she had locked away for so long she had forgotten it was there. She cried, and Raven stood there without taking another step, without touching her, because he knew she needed to cry, and he knew that sometimes the best thing wasn't wiping someone's tears away, but standing close enough for them to know they weren't crying alone. Brutus lay down between them, his head resting on his front paws, looking up at her, then at him, then back at her again. His tail wagging lightly, slowly, patiently. The dog had brought him to her the first time. And now, in the cramped apartment in Springfield, he lay between them again, patient, waiting for them to find their own way back to each other. Raven called Conrad that very night from the parking lot in front of Finn's building in Springfield. He had only one request: find the best hospital in Boston for kidney and joint care, reserve a private room, and prepare a car to bring Agnes Dawson there tomorrow morning. Conrad didn't ask why, because Conrad didn't need to ask. He only said, "Done," and hung up. The next morning, when Finn opened the door and saw a black SUV parked below with a private nurse and a mobile stretcher, she looked at Raven with the expression she had learned to read during the 6 months they had lived together. It wasn't the look of a man giving orders. It was the look of a man begging. Only Raven begged by never using the word please. Agnes refused. Of course she refused. She sat in her wheelchair in the old county hospital room in Springfield, where she was undergoing dialysis 3 times a week, looked at Raven with the eyes of a woman who had 60 years of nursing and 74 years of living behind her, and said, "I don't take mafia money, young man. No matter how nice your suit is, that money's still dirty." Raven pulled up a chair beside her bed, said nothing, and picked up the small knife and the apple on the table and began to peel it, slowly, clumsily, unevenly, the kind of peeling Jonah used to do in the kitchen of the wooden house when he tried to help Finn prepare dinner, and always ended up peeling away half the fruit because his hand still wasn't used to holding a knife. Agnes watched the way he peeled the apple, watched those large hands holding that tiny knife with more care than necessary, and she realized it. He was peeling it the way Jonah had, not because he didn't know how to do it better, but because he wanted her to see that Jonah was still in there. "That foolish Jonah boy is still in there, isn't he?" she asked, her voice much gentler than it had been 30 seconds earlier. Raven set the plate of badly peeled apple slices on the table beside her bed, looked at her, and for the first time since recovering, smiled. It wasn't the Raven's cold smile. It wasn't Jonah's innocent smile. It was the smile somewhere in between. The smile of a man who had lived both lives and kept the best part of each. "Always, ma'am." Agnes looked at him for 5 more seconds, then at the ugly plate of apple slices, then back at him, and let out the sigh of someone who knew she'd lost, but hadn't really wanted to win. "A private room is fine, but if I see anybody in a black suit walking up and down the hallway, I'll wheel myself back to Springfield." Raven nodded. Agnes was transferred to Massachusetts General Hospital, to the renal unit, a private room on the 8th floor overlooking the Charles River. The specialists reevaluated her entire condition: severe arthritis, but manageable with the right medication, and stage 3 kidney failure that needed close monitoring, but didn't yet require a transplant. With the proper treatment plan, the proper medicine, the proper nutrition, she could live comfortably for many more years. All the things Finn hadn't been able to afford for so many years were now within reach. And Finn stood in the hospital hallway watching her grandmother lying in a clean bed beneath a warm blanket, nurses checking on her every hour, and she had to turn toward the wall because she didn't want anyone seeing her eyes go wet. In the following month, Raven did 2 things. The first was this: he bought back the wooden house in Greenfield. The previous buyer had been a small real estate company in Springfield that planned to tear it down and build a lodge. Raven bought it back for 3 times the price without bargaining. Then he hired workers to repair it, reinforce the foundation, replace the tin roof, fix the hinges, install a new heating system, replace the water pipes, but he kept everything else exactly the same. The wooden floor still creaked in the same 3 places Finn knew by heart: the old kitchen table, the wooden chair by the window, the front steps, the dented aluminum kettle. When Conrad asked why he didn't just build a new place and save himself the trouble, Raven replied, "That's where I learned how to be human. You don't rebuild something like that from scratch." The second thing he did was help Finn open a shop. Not a shop he opened and simply put her name on, but a shop Finn built from the ground up, using her knowledge of herbs, Agnes's tea recipes, and the customers she had been selling to for years at the Greenfield market. Raven only provided the capital, using legal money from the real estate side of the DeLuca empire that he had begun separating and operating cleanly. The shop was small, on Greenfield's main street, selling herbs, teas, and natural wellness products. Finn named it Agnes and Brutus, and when Agnes heard the name from her hospital bed, she laughed so hard the nurse had to come in and check on her because she thought something was wrong. Then came that afternoon, a late autumn afternoon, with New England painted gold, orange, and red from the hills to the edge of the woods, the kind of afternoon where the light stretched longer than usual, as though even the sun wanted to stay a little more. Raven took Finn back to the wooden house. No SUV, no bodyguards, just the two of them, with Brutus stretched across the back seat, and the red dirt road leading them back to where everything had begun. The house had been repaired, but when Finn stepped onto the porch, she heard the floor creak in the same 3 old places, and she stopped, closed her eyes, and breathed in deeply, because those 3 sounds held more memory than any photograph ever could. The two of them sat on the steps, in the same old place. Brutus lay at their feet. The sunset poured over the line of oaks. "I've lived 2 lives," Raven said, his voice slow, choosing every word. "One life where I controlled everything except myself, and one life where I couldn't control anything, but for the first time, I felt free." He stood up, turned toward Finn, and went down on one knee on the old wooden steps. Raven DeLuca, the boss of the DeLuca Empire, the Raven, the man Boston feared, knelt before the herb seller from the Greenfield market. He opened the small box in his hand. Brutus immediately lunged between them, shoved his muzzle into the ring box, and licked Raven straight across the face. Finn burst out laughing, the kind of laugh where tears and laughter come at the same time and you can't tell which is greater. "Brutus, move." Raven, with dog slobber on his face, one hand pushing Brutus away and the other still holding the ring box, said, "Marry me, Finn. Not the Raven, not Jonah, just the man you saved, and the man who'll spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that." Finn looked at him, looked at the ring box, looked at Brutus sitting between them, tail wagging, tongue hanging out, looking deeply pleased with himself. "Yes," she said. Then she looked down at Brutus. "And as for you, you've been saying yes since the very first day." The wedding took place 3 weeks later at the wooden house. Small, simple, exactly the way both of them wanted it. Agnes sat in the front row in a new wheelchair she still grumbled was too fancy for a tea cellar, but her eyes shone brighter than any light in the garden. Conrad Vale stood beside Raven as his best man, wearing a suit, though his collar sat slightly crooked because he wasn't used to standing in this position. He was used to standing behind, not beside. Walt Briggs sat in the second row and cried harder than anyone there, using up 3 handkerchiefs and 1 corner of his apron. And when someone asked him why he was crying so much, he said, "I watched those 2 from the days when that boy was still scared of strangers at the market. I've earned the right to cry." Brutus walked down the aisle with a small ring box tied to a white ribbon around his neck, stepping slowly, solemnly, as if the dog understood exactly what his role was and was taking it very seriously. Finn walked down the grassy path between the rows of chairs. No expensive wedding dress, only a simple white dress Agnes had chosen. But when Raven saw her, when his eyes met hers, he cried. Raven DeLuca, who hadn't cried in front of anyone since the day his father died, stood on the steps of the wooden house where he had once been afraid of the dark, and cried, without hiding it, without shame. He cried because 10 months earlier he had lain in the forest waiting to die, and a wrinkled-faced dog had decided he deserved to live. And at last, we've reached the end of the story. People will tell many stories about Raven DeLuca, about the empire he built, the enemies he defeated, the power he held. But the true story didn't begin in Boston. It began in the woods outside Greenfield, where a dog found a dying man, where a poor girl chose to save a stranger, and where the cruelest mafia boss in America woke up with the heart of a child. Because sometimes, to find your true self again, you have to forget everything you once were. And sometimes, what saves you isn't power or money, but a gentle hand, a wooden house, and a wrinkled-faced dog who knew you were worthy of love before anyone else did. This story reminds us that no matter how harsh life becomes, no matter who we are or what we've done, there's always a chance to begin again. There's always someone willing to give us faith when we have nothing left. And true love never comes from status or wealth, but from sincerity and the simplest kindness. So what about you? How did this story make you feel? In real life, have you ever met someone who changed your life through nothing more than simple kindness? We'd truly love to hear what you feel in the deepest part of your heart, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched you, please press like to support us. Share this video with the people you love to spread its message. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss more stories each day. We wish all of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peaceful, gentle days ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.